In 1812, a young Swiss explorer named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt disguised himself as an Arab pilgrim, adopted the name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, and persuaded a local guide to lead him through a narrow gorge in the mountains of southern Jordan, a gorge so deep and so narrow that the sky above was reduced to a thin ribbon of blue between walls of red sandstone that rose more than 80 meters on either side. The gorge, called the Sick, wound through the rock for more than a kilometer, its walls carved by water and time into shapes that seemed almost organic, as though the stone itself were alive. And then, at the end of the Sick, the gorge opened, and Burckhardt saw what no European had seen in more than 500 years. A facade of breathtaking beauty carved directly into the living rock of the cliff face, a temple or a tomb more than 40 meters high, with columns and pediments and sculptured figures rendered in the pink and salmon and amber sandstone of the desert, glowing in the afternoon light with a warmth and a radiance that seemed to come not from the sun but from the stone itself. Burckhardt had rediscovered Petra, the lost city of the Nabataeans, and in doing so he had revealed to the modern world one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of human civilization, a city carved from stone in the heart of the desert by a people who had turned the most inhospitable landscape on earth into one of the wealthiest and most powerful kingdoms of the ancient world, the Nabataeans. The name is unfamiliar to most people, overshadowed by the more famous civilizations of the ancient Near East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, the great empires that dominate the textbooks and the popular imagination. But the Nabataeans were, in their own way, as remarkable as any of these civilizations, because they accomplished something that none of the others managed. They built a wealthy, sophisticated, and culturally distinctive civilization in the middle of the desert, in a region where rainfall averages less than 100 millimeters per year, where temperatures can exceed 50 degrees Celsius in summer, where water is scarce, vegetation is sparse, and the landscape is composed almost entirely of sand, rock, and sky. The Nabataeans did not merely survive in this environment, they thrived in it, building a trading empire that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean, from the Red Sea to Damascus, controlling the incense trade routes that carried frankincense and myrrh from the production centers of southern Arabia to the markets of the Mediterranean world, and accumulating a wealth so great that it attracted the envy of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the greed of the Roman Republic, and the military might of the Roman Empire. The city of Petra was the capital of this trading empire, and it remains, more than 2,000 years after its construction, one of the most visually stunning and most architecturally audacious sites in the ancient world. The Nabataeans did not build Petra from quarried stone, as the Egyptians built their pyramids or the Romans their temples. They carved it from the living rock of the desert, cutting into the cliff faces of the sandstone mountains to create facades, temples, tombs, and ritual spaces of extraordinary beauty and sophistication, facades that combine elements of Greek, Roman, Egyptian, and indigenous Arabian architectural traditions into a style that is uniquely Nabataean and that has no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. The treasury, the most famous of Petra's monuments, the facade that Burckhardt saw at the end of the Sick, is merely the most visible example of a rock-cut architecture that includes more than 800 individual monuments, tombs, temples, banqueting halls, and water channels spread across an area of roughly 60 square kilometers of desert terrain. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand who the Nabataeans were, where they came from, how they built their desert empire, and why they disappeared. You are going to learn about the ingenuity of a people who mastered the art of water management in one of the driest environments on Earth. You are going to see how a nomadic tribe of Arabian origin transformed itself into a kingdom of merchants, architects, engineers, and artists. And you are going to confront the mystery of a civilization that was, for a brief moment in history, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the ancient Near East, and that vanished so completely that its capital city was lost to the Western world for more than half a millennium. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of the Nabataeans is not merely a story about an ancient people and their remarkable city. It is a story about human adaptability, about the capacity of the human mind to find opportunity where others see only desolation, to create beauty where others see only barrenness, and to build wealth where others see only the empty vastness of the desert. The Nabataeans looked at the desert and saw not an obstacle but an advantage, not a wasteland but a highway, not a prison but a home. Their story is the story of what happens when human ingenuity meets human determination in a landscape that seems designed to defeat both. Now, let's begin. To understand the Nabataeans, we must first understand the landscape that shaped them, because the story of the Nabataeans is inseparable from the geography of the desert, a geography that determined their economy, their politics, their religion, their architecture, and their ultimate fate. The Nabataean homeland lay in the region that is today divided between southern Jordan, the Negev desert of southern Israel, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, and the northwestern corner of Saudi Arabia. It is a landscape of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary harshness, a landscape of sandstone mountains and deep wadis, of broad gravel plains and narrow gorges, of scorching heat and bitter cold, of blinding sunlight and pitch-black nights. The rainfall in this region averages between 50 and 100 millimeters per year, a fraction of the amount needed for conventional agriculture, and the temperatures swing from extremes of more than 50 degrees Celsius in the summer to below freezing on winter nights. Water, the essential resource for any civilization, is scarce, unpredictable, and fleeting, falling in brief, violent storms that send flash floods roaring down the wadis before disappearing into the sand, leaving the landscape as dry and as parched as before. This is the landscape in which the Nabataeans built their civilization. This is the landscape that they transformed, through an extraordinary feat of hydraulic engineering, into a habitat capable of supporting a city of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people, a city with gardens, with fountains, with pools, with an elaborate system of water channels, cisterns, dams, and aqueducts that captured, stored, and distributed every drop of the precious rainfall that fell on the surrounding mountains. The Nabataean water management system was one of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it was the essential foundation on which the entire civilization was built. Because without water, nothing else was possible, not the city, not the trade, not the wealth, not the art, not the architecture, not the civilization itself. The origins of the Nabataeans are obscure, a common feature of peoples who begin as nomads and who enter the historical record only when they come into contact, usually conflictual, with the literate civilizations that surround them. The earliest historical reference to the Nabataeans comes from the Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, who, drawing on the earlier account of the historian Hieronymus of Cardia, describes an encounter between the Nabataeans and the forces of Antigonus the One-Eyed, one of the successors of Alexander the Great, in approximately 312 before the Common Era. Diodorus describes the Nabataeans as a nomadic people who lived in the desert, who disdained agriculture and the construction of permanent dwellings, who kept their wealth in the form of frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatics, and who were fiercely independent, resisting all attempts by the Hellenistic kingdoms to conquer or to control them. The account is significant both for what it tells us about the Nabataeans in the late 4th century before the Common Era, a nomadic, trade-oriented people who had already established control over the incense trade routes, and for what it suggests about the transformation that the Nabataeans would undergo over the following centuries, the transformation from a nomadic tribe to a settled kingdom, from tent dwellers to city builders, from desert raiders to international merchants. The transformation of the Nabataeans from nomads to city builders was driven by trade, specifically by the incense trade, the long-distance commerce in frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic substances that connected the production centers of southern Arabia, in what is today Yemen and Oman, to the consumption markets of the Mediterranean world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and the cities of the Hellenistic Near East. Frankincense and myrrh were among the most valuable commodities of the ancient world, used in religious ritual, in medicine, in cosmetics, and in the preparation of the dead for burial, and the demand for these substances in the Mediterranean world was enormous and sustained, creating a trade route that was one of the most profitable in the ancient world, and that remained active for more than 1,000 years. The Nabataeans controlled the northern terminus of this trade route, the point at which the overland caravan routes from southern Arabia converged on the markets of the Mediterranean world. The caravans travelled north from Yemen through the western Arabian Peninsula, along a route that passed through the oases of the Hejaz, through the deserts of what is today northwestern Saudi Arabia, and into the Nabataean homeland, where the goods were collected, stored, taxed, and redistributed to the markets of Gaza, Alexandria, Damascus, and other Mediterranean and Near Eastern cities. The Nabataeans did not produce the incense themselves. They were middlemen, intermediaries who controlled the critical bottleneck in the supply chain, the point at which the goods passed from the Arabian producers to the Mediterranean consumers, and who charged a premium for their services, a premium that was justified by the difficulty and the danger of the desert crossing, and by the logistical infrastructure, the water stations, the rest stops, the security patrols that the Nabataeans maintained along the route. The incense trade was not the only source of Nabataean wealth. The Nabataeans also traded in spices, silk, ivory, gold, and other luxury goods that travelled along the same trade routes, as well as in bitumen from the Dead Sea, a substance that was used in the mummification process in Egypt, and that the Nabataeans harvested and exported in considerable quantities. The Nabataeans were also involved in the trade in copper from the mines of the Wadi Fainan and the Wadi Araba, metals that were essential for the economies of the ancient Near East, and that added to the diversity and the resilience of the Nabataean economic base. The combination of the incense trade, the spice trade, the bitumen trade, and the metals trade made the Nabataeans one of the wealthiest peoples in the ancient Near East, a wealth that is reflected in the grandeur of their architecture, the sophistication of their art, and the reach of their diplomatic and commercial connections. The city of Petra, which became the Nabataean capital sometime in the late 4th or early 3rd century before the Common Era, was ideally situated to serve as the hub of this trading empire. The city lies in a basin surrounded by sandstone mountains, accessible through a small number of narrow gorges, the most famous of which is the Sick, the winding canyon through which Burckhardt entered the city in 1812. The location provided natural defences against military attack, because the narrow approaches could be easily defended by a small number of warriors, making the city virtually impregnable to the conventional military tactics of the ancient world. The location also provided access to water, because the surrounding mountains channeled rainfall into the wadis that converged on the Petra Basin, creating a natural catchment area that the Nabataeans exploited through their elaborate system of dams, channels, and cisterns. The population of Petra at its peak has been estimated by various scholars at between 20,000 and 30,000 people, a population that was comparable in size to many of the cities of the Hellenistic and Roman world, and that was remarkable for a city located in the middle of a desert. The estimate is based on the number of residential structures that have been identified in archaeological surveys, on the capacity of the water management system, and on the density of habitation in the areas of the city that have been excavated. Some scholars have proposed higher estimates, arguing that the population may have been as large as 40,000 during the reign of Aretas IV, when the city was at the height of its prosperity, while others have proposed lower estimates, arguing that the residential areas of the city were less densely populated than the surveys suggest. Whatever the precise figure, the population of Petra was substantial, and the fact that it was sustained in a desert environment by an artificial water supply is itself a remarkable achievement. The city of Petra was not merely a collection of rock-cut tombs and facades. It was a living, functioning urban centre with all the infrastructure of a Hellenistic city, including freestanding temples, markets, residential neighbourhoods, workshops, bathhouses, and a large theatre that could seat more than 8,000 spectators. The freestanding buildings of the city centre which were constructed from quarried stone rather than carved from the living rock, have been less well preserved than the rock-cut monuments, because they were more susceptible to earthquake damage and to the erosion of wind and water. But the archaeological excavations of the past several decades have revealed a city centre that was as impressive in its freestanding architecture as it was in its rock-cut monuments. The Temple of Qasr al-Bint, the most prominent freestanding building in the city centre, was the principal temple of the Nabataean capital, probably dedicated to the chief deity Dushara. The temple stands at the end of the colonnaded street, at the focal point of the city's urban axis, and its position and its size reflect the importance of Dushara worship in the religious life of the Nabataean capital. The temple was built of local sandstone, with carved and plastered decoration that included painted stucco, carved stone ornament, and gilded details that must have made the building one of the most visually striking structures in the city. The temple has been partially reconstructed by modern archaeologists, and its surviving walls, which stand more than 20 meters high, give some sense of the scale and the grandeur of the original building. The Nabataean water management system at Petra was a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering. The system consisted of a network of dams, channels, pipes, cisterns, and reservoirs that captured the rainfall that fell on the surrounding mountains, transported it through channels carved into the rock, or through terracotta pipes to collection points within the city, and stored it in cisterns and reservoirs that provided a year-round water supply for the population. The system included more than 200 cisterns carved into the rock around the city, each capable of holding thousands of litres of water, as well as a number of larger reservoirs and pools that served as communal water sources and as decorative features in the urban landscape. The Nabataean engineers channeled water from springs several kilometres away through an aqueduct system that included both open channels and closed ceramic pipes, an achievement that required precise surveying, careful construction, and a detailed understanding of the principles of hydraulic engineering. The spring of Ain Musa, located several kilometres east of the city, was one of the principal water sources for Petra, and the Nabataeans constructed an aqueduct system that carried the water from the spring into the city through a combination of open channels, closed ceramic pipes, and rock-cut tunnels. The aqueduct was a significant engineering achievement, requiring the careful surveying of the terrain, the precise calculation of the gradient needed to maintain a steady flow of water, and the construction of settling basins, distribution junctions, and overflow mechanisms that ensured the reliable and efficient delivery of water to the different parts of the city. The Nabataean engineers also constructed a dam at the entrance to the Sik, the narrow gorge that was the main approach to the city, to protect the gorge from the flash floods that periodically swept down the wadi during the winter rains. The dam diverted the floodwaters into a tunnel that bypassed the Sik and channeled the water into cisterns on the other side of the gorge, simultaneously protecting the Sik from flood damage and capturing the floodwaters for storage and later use. The Nabataean approach to water management was not limited to the collection and the storage of rainfall. The Nabataeans also exploited the groundwater resources of the desert through the construction of wells and through the development of techniques for locating and accessing underground water sources. The Nabataean wells, some of which were tens of meters deep, tapped into the aquifers that lay beneath the desert surface, providing a supplementary water source that was less dependent on the vagaries of rainfall than the surface collection systems. The combination of surface water collection, groundwater extraction, and long-distance water transport from springs gave the Nabataean water system a resilience and a redundancy that enabled it to sustain the population of Petra through the droughts and the dry periods that are a regular feature of the desert climate. The scale of the Nabataean water management achievement can be appreciated by comparison with the natural rainfall of the region. Petra receives an average of roughly 150 millimeters of rainfall per year, enough to support sparse desert vegetation, but far too little to sustain a city of tens of thousands of people without artificial water collection and storage. The Nabatean engineers solved this problem by treating the entire landscape around the city as a water catchment area, capturing the rainfall that fell on the mountains and the surrounding terrain and channeling it into the city through an integrated network of collection, transport, and storage infrastructure. The system was so effective that it not only provided drinking water and water for domestic use, but also supported agriculture on irrigated terraces, ornamental gardens and pools within the city, and industrial activities such as pottery production and metalworking that required significant quantities of water. The Nabataean kingdom was not merely a city-state centered on Petra. It was a territorial state that controlled a vast area of the desert, from the Hauran in southern Syria to the Hijaz in northwestern Arabia, from the shores of the Red Sea to the edge of the Fertile Crescent. The kingdom's territorial extent was both its strength and its vulnerability, because the vast distances involved in administering and defending the territory required a network of settlements, roads, and communication systems that was expensive to maintain, and that stretched the kingdom's resources to the limit. The Nabataeans maintained this network through a combination of military garrisons, caravan stations, and agricultural settlements that were spread across the territory and that were connected by a system of roads and tracks that facilitated both trade and military movement. The Nabataean road system was one of the most important but least appreciated achievements of the civilization. The Nabataeans built and maintained a network of roads that connected Petra to the other major settlements of the kingdom, and to the caravan routes that linked the kingdom to the wider world. The roads were marked by milestones, maintained by road crews, and protected by military patrols, and they were designed to facilitate the rapid movement of caravans, military forces, and official communications across the vast distances of the kingdom. The road from Petra to Gaza, one of the most important trade routes in the Nabataean system, crossed more than 200 kilometers of desert terrain, and the Nabataeans maintained a series of caravan stations, or caravanserais, along the route, each equipped with water cisterns, animal pens, and sheltered spaces where the caravans could rest and resupply before continuing their journey. The Nabataean diet, as reconstructed from the analysis of plant remains, animal bones, and pottery residues at Nabataean sites, reflects the diverse economic base of the civilization. The Nabataeans consumed wheat, barley, dates, figs, grapes, olives, and a variety of legumes and vegetables, supplemented by the meat of sheep, goats, and cattle, and by fish and shellfish from the Gulf of Aqaba and the Dead Sea. The presence of imported food items at Nabataean sites, including Egyptian grain, Levantine olive oil, and Mediterranean wine, testifies to the integration of the Nabataean economy into the broader commercial networks of the ancient Near East, and to the purchasing power of the Nabataean elite, who could afford to import luxury food items from distant sources. The diversity of the Nabataean diet is itself a measure of the success of the Nabataean agricultural system, which was capable of producing a wide range of crops in a desert environment that would have been considered unsuitable for agriculture by most contemporary civilizations. The Nabataean coinage provides another window into the sophistication and the cultural distinctiveness of the civilization. The Nabataeans minted their own coins from the late 2nd century, before the Common Era onward, producing silver and bronze coins that depicted the portraits of the Nabataean kings and queens, often in pairs, and that bore inscriptions in the Nabataean script that identified the rulers and their titles. The Nabataean coins are significant for several reasons. They demonstrate that the Nabataean kingdom possessed the organizational capacity and the economic resources to maintain a royal mint, an institution that was characteristic of the sophisticated Hellenistic kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean. They provide a sequence of royal portraits that is invaluable for the reconstruction of the Nabataean royal chronology and for the study of Nabataean artistic conventions, and they demonstrate the unusual prominence of royal women in the Nabataean political system. Because Nabataean coins frequently depict the queen alongside the king, a practice that is unusual in the coinage of the ancient Near East, and that suggests that Nabataean queens held a more prominent political role than their counterparts in most contemporary and civilizations. The prominence of women in the Nabatean political system is attested not only by the coinage, but also by the inscriptions and by the literary evidence from classical sources. Several Nabatean queens are known by name, and some of them appear to have exercised significant political power, serving as regents for minor kings or as co-rulers alongside their husbands. The Nabatean legal traditions, as documented in the tomb inscriptions from Hegra, also suggest a relatively high status for women, with women appearing as property owners, as patrons of tomb construction, and as participants in legal transactions on terms that are comparable to those of men. The evidence for the status of women in Nabatean society is limited and must be interpreted with caution, but it suggests a society in which women had a greater degree of economic independence and political visibility than was typical of the ancient Near East. The political organization of the Nabatean kingdom evolved alongside its economic and cultural development from the tribal leadership of the early nomadic period to the centralized monarchy of the later urban period. The Nabataean kings, who are attested in the historical and the epigraphic record from the late 4th century before the Common Era onward, ruled a kingdom that combined elements of the Arabian tribal tradition, in which the leader's authority depended on the consent and the support of the tribal elders, with elements of the Hellenistic monarchical tradition, in which the king's authority was absolute and was legitimized by divine sanction, military power, and dynastic succession. The Nabatean kingship was hereditary, passing from father to son within the royal family, but the succession was not always smooth, and the historical record contains evidence of power struggles, usurpations, and dynastic disputes that suggest a political system that was more fluid and more contested than the formal institutions of the monarchy might suggest. The Nabataean administrative system, as far as it can be reconstructed from the epigraphic and the archaeological evidence, was organized around the palace at Petra, which served as the center of government, the seat of the royal court, and the administrative hub of the kingdom. The palace was supported by a network of regional governors, military commanders, and local officials who administered the various regions of the kingdom, and who reported to the king and his ministers at Petra. The administrative language of the kingdom was Nabataean Aramaic, and the inscriptions that have been found at Nabataean sites across the territory provide evidence for a literate bureaucracy that maintained records of property ownership, tax assessment, legal transactions, and religious dedications, a bureaucracy that was essential for the administration of a kingdom that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of desert terrain, and that included dozens of settlements, hundreds of farms, and thousands of individual water management installations. The Nabataean kingdom reached the height of its power and prosperity in the late 1st century before the Common Era and the early 1st century of the Common Era during the reigns of Obodas III and Aretas IV, a period that is sometimes called the Golden Age of the Nabataean civilization. During this period, the city of Petra was transformed from a prosperous trading town into a monumental city of palaces, temples, markets, theatres, and public spaces that was worthy of comparison with the great Hellenistic cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The theatre at Petra, carved into the rock of the hillside overlooking the city centre, could seat more than 8,000 spectators, and is one of the most impressive examples of rock-cut architecture in the ancient world. The colonnaded street that ran through the centre of the city, flanked by shops and public buildings, was laid out in the Hellenistic manner and was paved with stone, creating a grand urban axis that connected the major public buildings of the city and that provided a setting for the public ceremonies and the commercial activities that were the lifeblood of the Nabataean capital. The colonnaded street of Petra, which ran through the centre of the city from the theatre to the Casa al-Bint temple, was one of the most impressive features of the Nabataean urban landscape. The street was approximately 6 meters wide, paved with large stone slabs, and flanked on both sides by colonnades of stone columns that supported roofed porticos under which shops and businesses operated. The colonnaded street was a standard feature of Hellenistic and Roman urban planning, and its presence at Petra demonstrates the degree to which the Nabataean city had adopted the conventions of Mediterranean urbanism while adapting them to the specific conditions and the specific needs of a desert environment. The street was not merely a thoroughfare. It was the commercial and social heart of the city, the place where merchants displayed their goods, where citizens conducted their business, and where the public life of the community was enacted. The theatre at Petra, carved into the hillside on the east side of the Wadi Musa, is one of the most impressive examples of rock-cut architecture at the site and one of the largest theatres in the ancient Near East. The theatre could seat more than 8,000 spectators in 45 rows of seats that were carved directly from the living rock, and its stage building, which was constructed from quarried stone, included an elaborate facade decorated with columns, niches, and sculptured ornament in the Hellenistic style. The theatre was used for both theatrical performances and public assemblies, and its construction demonstrates the degree to which the Nabataean elite had adopted the cultural practices of the Hellenistic and Roman world, including the tradition of theatrical entertainment and public spectacle. That was one of the defining features of Mediterranean urban culture. The Nabataean economy during this golden age was not limited to the incense trade. The Nabataeans had diversified their economic base to include agriculture, particularly the cultivation of grapes and the production of wine, as well as the manufacture of pottery, textiles, and other craft products that were sold in the markets of the Mediterranean world. The Nabataean wine industry was particularly important because it demonstrated the capacity of the Nabataean agricultural system to produce high-value export crops in a desert environment, a demonstration that challenged the assumption that desert agriculture was limited to subsistence production. The Nabataean vineyards of the Negev, irrigated by the runoff agriculture system that was one of the distinctive achievements of the Nabataean civilization, produced wines that were traded across the Mediterranean, a product that supplemented the declining revenues of the incense trade, and that helped to sustain the Nabataean economy during the period of transition from trade-based to agriculture-based. Prosperity. The incense trade that sustained the Nabataean economy was one of the great commercial enterprises of the ancient world, a trade that connected the frankincense forests of southern Arabia to the temples, the bathhouses, the funeral pyres, and the private households of the Mediterranean civilizations, a trade that was measured not in tons but in camel loads, and that generated profits that were, by any ancient standard, enormous. The value of frankincense and myrrh in the ancient Mediterranean world is difficult to overstate. Frankincense was burned in every temple in the Greek and Roman world, was used in the preparation of medicines and cosmetics, was consumed in vast quantities at the funeral pyres of the Roman elite, and was considered essential for the proper conduct of religious ritual. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, estimated that the Roman Empire spent more than 100 million sesterces per year on incense and spices from Arabia and India, a figure that, even if exaggerated, gives some sense of the scale of the trade and of the wealth that it generated for those who controlled it. The overland incense trade route, which the Nabataeans controlled, was one of the longest and most arduous commercial routes in the ancient world. The route began in the frankincense-producing regions of the Dhofar coast in modern Oman and in the highlands of modern Yemen, where the resin of the boswellia tree was harvested, processed, and loaded onto camels for the journey north. The caravans travelled north through the Arabian Peninsula, following a route that passed through the oases and the rest stops of the Hejaz, crossing more than 2,000 kilometers of desert terrain before reaching the Nabataean homeland and the markets of the Mediterranean world. The journey took roughly 65 to 70 days, depending on the route and the conditions, and the caravans consisted of hundreds or even thousands of camels, each carrying a load of several hundred pounds of incense and other trade goods, accompanied by guards, drivers, and merchants who made their livelihood from the trade. The Nabataeans did not merely provide a passive corridor for the passage of the caravans. They actively managed the trade, providing water, food, fodder, security, and logistical services to the caravans that passed through their territory and they charged a premium for these services that was a significant source of revenue for the Nabataean economy. The Nabataean caravan stations, spaced at intervals of roughly 1 day's travel along the major trade routes, provided the infrastructure that made the long-distance overland trade possible, and the Nabataean military, which patrolled the trade routes and protected the caravans from raids by nomadic tribes, provided the security that the merchants needed to risk their capital on the dangerous desert crossing. The relationship between the Nabataean kingdom and the Roman Empire during this period was complex and multifaceted, involving elements of diplomacy, trade, competition, and occasional military confrontation. The Nabataean kings maintained diplomatic relations with Rome from the early 1st century before the Common Era onward, and the kingdom served as a buffer state between the Roman provinces of Syria and Egypt and the nomadic tribes of the Arabian interior, a role that was valued by the Roman authorities, and that helped to preserve Nabataean independence for more than a century after the Roman conquest of the neighboring regions. The Nabataeans contributed military forces to Roman campaigns on several occasions, and the Nabataean cavalry, renowned for its skill in desert warfare, was a valued ally of the Roman army. At the same time, the growing Roman commercial presence in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean was progressively undermining the Nabataean monopoly on the incense trade, creating an economic tension that coexisted with the political alliance. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem of Nabataean studies is the problem of disappearance. The question of how a civilization that was, at its peak, one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the ancient Near East, a civilization that built one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world, could have declined so completely that its capital city was lost to the Western world for centuries, and that the Nabataean people themselves vanished from the historical record as a distinct cultural entity. The decline of the Nabataean kingdom was not a sudden catastrophe but a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries, driven by the interaction of political, economic, and environmental factors that progressively eroded the foundations on which Nabataean wealth and power were based. The process began in the 1st century before the Common Era, when the Nabataean kingdom came under increasing pressure from the expanding Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire, and it culminated in 106 of the Common Era, when the Roman Emperor Trajan annexed the Nabataean kingdom as the province of Arabia Petraea, ending Nabataean political independence and incorporating the Nabataean territories into the Roman administrative system. The Roman annexation of the Nabataean kingdom in 106 of the Common Era is one of the most significant and most debated events in Nabataean history, because the circumstances surrounding the annexation are poorly documented, and because the motivations of the Roman Emperor Trajan in ordering the annexation remain unclear. The last known Nabataean king, Rabel II, who ruled from approximately 71 to 106 of the Common Era, appears to have adopted a policy of accommodation toward Rome, maintaining peaceful relations with the empire and possibly even agreeing to a peaceful transfer of power upon his death. Some scholars have argued that the annexation was the result of a prior agreement between Rabel and the Roman authorities, an arrangement in which the Nabataean kingdom would be absorbed into the Roman Empire upon the death of the last king, peacefully and without military conflict. Others have argued that the annexation was a military conquest ordered by Trajan as part of his broader strategy of territorial expansion in the eastern provinces, and that the Nabataean kingdom was annexed by force over the opposition of at least some of the Nabataean population. The evidence for the circumstances of the annexation is limited and ambiguous. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing more than a century after the event, provides a brief account that suggests a military conquest, but the archaeological evidence from Petra and other Nabataean sites does not show the destruction layers or the evidence of military violence that would be expected if the annexation had involved significant armed resistance. The most likely scenario is that the annexation was relatively peaceful, a negotiated transfer of power that was facilitated by the long history of Nabataean Roman diplomatic relations and by the growing integration of the Nabataean economy into the Roman commercial system. And it gets worse. The Roman annexation was not the cause of the Nabataean decline, but merely one stage in a longer process of economic and demographic change that had been underway for decades before the annexation, and that continued for centuries afterward. The fundamental cause of the Nabataean decline was economic. The gradual shift of the incense trade routes from the overland caravan routes that the Nabataeans controlled to the maritime routes that connected southern Arabia to the Red Sea ports of Egypt, routes that bypassed the Nabataean territories entirely and that delivered the same goods to the same markets at lower cost and with greater speed. The shift from overland to maritime trade was driven by improvements in navigation technology, by the Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 before the Common Era, which gave the Romans direct access to the Red Sea and to the maritime routes to southern Arabia and India, and by the growing Roman demand for eastern luxury goods, a demand that outstripped the capacity of the overland caravan routes, and that created economic incentives for the development of alternative supply chains. The shift of the trade routes was devastating for the Nabataean economy, because it eliminated the middleman role that had been the foundation of Nabataean wealth. The Nabataeans had grown rich, not by producing goods, but by controlling the trade in goods that were produced elsewhere and consumed elsewhere. And when the trade routes shifted, the Nabataeans lost the competitive advantage that had sustained their economy for centuries. The decline of the incense trade did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process that unfolded over the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, a process during which the Nabataean economy diversified into agriculture, particularly the cultivation of grapes and the production of wine, and into other forms of trade and craft production, but that could not fully compensate for the loss of the incense revenue that had been the engine of Nabataean prosperity. The shift from overland to maritime trade was not merely an economic change. It was a structural transformation of the entire commercial system of the ancient world, a transformation that was comparable in its effects to the opening of the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope in the 15th century of the Common Era, which similarly destroyed the overland trade routes that had enriched the cities and the kingdoms of the Middle East. The Roman discovery and exploitation of the monsoon winds, which enabled ships to sail directly from the Red Sea ports of Egypt to the ports of southern Arabia and India, reduced the transit time for luxury goods from months to weeks, and eliminated the multiple layers of middlemen, including the Nabataeans, who had profited from the overland trade. The Nabataeans attempted to adapt to the changing commercial landscape by developing their own Red Sea port at Luke-Combe on the northwestern coast of Arabia, but the port never achieved the commercial importance of the Egyptian Red Sea ports, and the Nabataean share of the maritime trade remained a fraction of what it had been in the overland trade. The declining economic position of the Nabataean kingdom was reflected in the declining quality and the declining quantity of the architectural and artistic production at Petra. The monumental building programs of the late 1st century before the Common Era and the early 1st century of the Common Era, which had produced the treasury, the monastery, the royal tombs, the great temple, and the other great monuments of the site, came to an end after the reign of Aretas IV, and the subsequent period saw little new construction and a gradual deterioration of the existing buildings and infrastructure. The population of the city declined as the economic opportunities diminished, and the Nabataean elite, who had once been among the wealthiest merchants in the ancient Near East, found themselves increasingly marginalized in a world where the trade routes they had controlled had shifted to other channels, and where the political independence they had maintained for centuries had been absorbed by the Roman Empire. The environmental dimension of the Nabataean decline has received increasing attention from scholars in recent years. The Nabataean homeland was always a marginal environment, and the elaborate water management system that sustained the city of Petra required constant maintenance and repair to remain functional. As the Nabataean economy declined, and as the population of Petra shrank, the resources available for the maintenance of the water system declined as well, creating a downward spiral in which the deterioration of the water infrastructure reduced the carrying capacity of the city, which further reduced the population, which further reduced the resources available for maintenance, and so on. The earthquakes that struck the region, particularly the devastating earthquake of 363 of the Common Era, which caused extensive damage to the city's buildings and water infrastructure, accelerated the process of decline, destroying in minutes the accumulated work of centuries and reducing the city's capacity to support its remaining population. The period between the Roman annexation in 106 and the earthquake of 363 of the Common Era, roughly 250 years, was a period of gradual transformation during which Petra evolved from the capital of an independent kingdom to a provincial city within the Roman Empire. The city did not decline immediately after the annexation. In fact, some scholars have argued that the early Roman period saw a continuation of the building activity that had characterized the Nabataean Golden Age, with new temples, public buildings, and residential structures being constructed in the Roman architectural style alongside the existing Nabataean monuments. The Roman authorities invested in the infrastructure of the new province, building roads, fortifications, and public buildings that connected Petra to the wider Roman provincial system, and that facilitated the integration of the Nabataean economy into the Roman commercial network. The Via Nova Traiana, the great Roman road that connected Bosra in the north to Acaba in the south, passed through or near Petra, and provided a major transportation artery that linked the city to the other centres of the Roman provincial administration. But the prosperity of the early Roman period at Petra was deceptive because the underlying economic trends were running against the city. The shift of the trade routes to the maritime channels continued, and the commercial importance of Petra as a trading centre declined progressively throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The city remained an important regional centre, the seat of a Roman governor and the administrative capital of the province, but its role as a hub of international commerce was increasingly marginalized, and the wealth that had once flowed through the city from the incense trade was redirected to the Red Sea ports of Egypt and to the coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean. The population of the city declined. The maintenance of the buildings and the water infrastructure suffered, and the vibrant commercial life that had once characterized the colonnaded street and the markets of the city centre gradually faded. The earthquake of 363 of the Common Era was one of the most devastating natural disasters in the history of the region, and its effects on Petra were catastrophic. The earthquake, which is documented in contemporary literary sources, and which has been confirmed by geological and archaeological evidence, caused widespread destruction across the eastern Mediterranean, toppling buildings, collapsing columns, and disrupting the infrastructure of cities across a wide area. At Petra, the earthquake damaged or destroyed many of the city's freestanding buildings, including the Great Temple, the Temple of the Winged Lions, and numerous other structures that had survived the centuries of gradual decline following the Roman annexation. More importantly, the earthquake damaged the water management system that was the lifeline of the city, breaking the channels, cracking the cisterns, and disrupting the aqueducts that brought water from the surrounding springs into the heart of the city. The repair of the water system would have required a massive investment of labour and resources, an investment that the declining population and the diminished economy of 4th century Petra could not afford, and the failure to repair the system would have further reduced the carrying capacity of the city, accelerating the cycle of decline that eventually led to its abandonment. A second major earthquake struck the region in approximately 551 of the Common Era, causing additional damage and further accelerating the process of decline. By this time, the population of Petra had declined dramatically from its peak in the 1st century, and the city was no longer the capital of a kingdom or even a major regional centre, but a modest settlement of farmers, herders, and monks, living among the ruins of the once great Nabataean capital. The Christian community at Petra, which had been established in the 4th century, and which had adapted several of the Nabataean monuments for use as churches, continued to function into the 6th and 7th centuries, but its resources were limited and its population was small, and the city was a shadow of its former self. The process of Nabataean cultural decline was also influenced by the religious transformation of the region. The Nabataean religion, with its worship of Dushara, Al-Uzza, and the other deities of the Nabataean pantheon, was gradually replaced by Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries, as the Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its official religion, and as the new faith spread across the eastern provinces. The replacement of the Nabataean religion by Christianity was not merely a change of religious practice. It was a change of cultural identity, because the Nabataean religion had been intimately connected to the Nabataean sense of identity, to the sacred landscapes of the Nabataean homeland, and to the architectural and artistic traditions that had given physical expression to Nabataean spiritual life. The loss of the Nabataean religion was, in a sense, the loss of the Nabataean identity, the final step in a process of cultural assimilation that had been underway since the Roman annexation, and that was completed by the Christianization of the region. The evidence from the Negev cities provides a particularly detailed picture of the transition from Nabataean to Byzantine culture. The cities of Oboda, Alusa, Nasana, Shivta, and Mamshit, which were founded or expanded during the Nabataean period, continued to function as important settlements into the Byzantine period, and the archaeological evidence from these sites documents the gradual replacement of Nabataean cultural traditions by Byzantine Christian traditions over a period of several centuries. The Nabataean temples were abandoned or converted into churches. The Nabataean inscriptions gave way to Greek inscriptions. The Nabataean pottery tradition was replaced by the pottery traditions of the Roman and Byzantine periods. The transformation was gradual and incomplete, and elements of Nabataean cultural tradition persisted long after the formal institutions of the Nabataean kingdom had been absorbed into the Roman provincial system, but the direction of the transformation was clear, from a distinctive Nabataean cultural identity toward an increasingly homogenized Roman and Byzantine provincial identity. The Nesana Papyri, a collection of documents from the Negev city of Nesana, dating to the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era, provide a remarkable window into the final phase of this cultural transformation. The papyri, which include administrative records, tax documents, legal texts, and personal correspondence, are written in Greek and Arabic, reflecting the bilingual character of the community in the late Byzantine and early Islamic periods. So, the documents reveal a community that was adapting to the new political and cultural realities of the Islamic conquest while maintaining many of the agricultural and commercial practices that had been established during the Nabataean and Roman periods. The Nesana papyri demonstrate that the Nabataean cultural heritage, however transformed and diluted, continued to influence the life of the desert communities long after the Nabataean kingdom itself had ceased to exist. The Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century of the Common Era marked the final chapter in the story of the Nabataean civilization as a living cultural entity. The Arab armies that conquered the Levant and the Arabian Peninsula in the decades following the death of the Prophet Muhammad absorbed the remaining Nabataean-descended populations into the broader Arab and Islamic cultural milieu, completing the process of cultural assimilation that had begun with the Roman annexation and that had continued through the Christianization of the region. The Nabataean language, which had already been declining for centuries in favor of Greek and Aramaic, was replaced by Arabic, and the Nabataean cultural traditions were absorbed into the broader traditions of the Islamic world. The Nabataean people did not disappear in a physical sense. Their descendants are among the Arab populations of Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the neighboring countries. But the Nabataean cultural identity, the distinctive combination of Arabian, Hellenistic, and Roman elements that had characterized the Nabataean civilization, was lost, replaced by the new identities, Arab, Christian, Muslim, that the changing political and religious landscape of the region demanded. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The city of Petra was not merely abandoned, it was forgotten. After the Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century of the Common Era, knowledge of Petra's location and its significance gradually faded from the awareness of the wider world. The local Bedouin population knew of the ruins, of course, and they continued to use the caves and the rock-cut chambers of the ancient city for shelter and for storage. But the connection between the ruins and the once great Nabataean civilization was lost, and the city became merely another feature of the desert landscape, known to the locals but unknown to the outside world. The decline of Petra after the 7th century was accelerated by the shifting of the regional trade routes to other centres, particularly to the cities of the Hajj pilgrimage route, which carried the annual flow of Muslim pilgrims from the Mediterranean provinces to the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and which bypassed Petra entirely. The Hajj route, which passed through cities such as Amman, Man, and Tabuk, replaced the old Nabataean trade routes as the primary artery of commercial and cultural exchange in the region, and the cities along the Hajj route grew and prospered while the cities of the old Nabataean network, including Petra, declined and were eventually abandoned. The abandonment of Petra was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but the end point of a long process of economic marginalization, demographic decline, and infrastructural deterioration that had been underway for centuries, and that was completed by the shifting of the regional geography of trade and pilgrimage in the Islamic period. The Crusader period brought a brief revival of European interest in the region, and the Crusaders constructed a small fortress at the summit of the mountain overlooking the city, a fortress that was occupied for a few decades in the 12th century, before being abandoned when the Crusader states were driven out of the region by the forces of Saladin. After the departure of the Crusaders, Petra fell back into obscurity, known to the local Bedouin but unknown to the wider world, a lost city in the truest sense of the word. For more than 500 years, from the end of the Crusader period in the 13th century to Burckhardt's rediscovery in 1812, Petra was a lost city, its existence known only through vague references in ancient texts and through rumours and legends that circulated among the Bedouin tribes of the region. The loss of Petra is a striking example of how completely a civilization can be erased from human memory, how a city of tens of thousands of people, a city of extraordinary beauty and sophistication, can be swallowed by the desert and forgotten by the world. The scholarly understanding of the Nabataean civilization has evolved dramatically since Burckhardt's rediscovery of Petra in 1812. Passing through several distinct phases, each characterized by different theoretical frameworks, different methodological approaches, and different conclusions about the nature and the significance of the Nabataean achievement. The history of Nabataean studies is itself a fascinating story, a story of competing interpretations, of assumptions challenged and revised, of a civilization that has consistently surprised scholars by revealing itself to be more complex, more sophisticated, and more culturally distinctive than previous generations of researchers had imagined. The first phase of modern Nabataean studies was dominated by the exploration and the documentation of the visible monuments of Petra, the rock-cut facades that are the most spectacular and most recognizable feature of the site. The early European visitors to Petra, who followed in Burckhardt's footsteps throughout the 19th century, were overwhelmed by the beauty and the scale of the rock-cut architecture, and their accounts focused almost exclusively on the visible monuments, particularly the treasury, the monastery, the royal tombs, and the other great facades that line the gorges and the cliff faces around the city. The early visitors interpreted the monuments through the lens of classical architecture, recognizing the Greek columns, the Roman pediments, and the Egyptian obelisks that the Nabataeans had incorporated into their designs, and they concluded that the Nabataean architecture was derivative, a provincial imitation of Hellenistic and Roman models that lacked the originality and the sophistication of its classical predecessors. But here is the problem with this early interpretation. It failed to recognize the originality and the distinctiveness of Nabataean architecture, which was not merely an imitation of classical models, but a creative synthesis of multiple architectural traditions: Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and indigenous Arabian, combined in ways that had no parallel anywhere else in the ancient world. The Nabataean architects were not provincial imitators. They were creative innovators who drew on a wide range of architectural vocabularies and who combined them in ways that were uniquely their own, producing a style that was immediately recognizable and that expressed a cultural identity that was distinct from any of the civilizations that had influenced it. The treasury, for example, combines a classical Corinthian facade with an upper story that includes a tholos, a circular temple form, flanked by figures that may represent Isis, the Egyptian goddess, or a Nabataean deity with Isis-like attributes, the whole executed in the rose-red sandstone of the Petra Mountains in a style that is as distinctive as it is beautiful. A second phase of Nabataean studies, beginning in the mid-20th century, shifted the focus from the visible monuments to the broader landscape of the Nabataean homeland, revealing the extent and the sophistication of the Nabataean settlement pattern and the Nabataean agricultural and hydraulic infrastructure. The pioneering work of the American archaeologist Nelson Gluck, who conducted extensive surveys of the Negev Desert and the Jordanian highlands in the 1930s and 40s, revealed hundreds of previously unknown Nabataean sites, including farms, villages, caravan stations, military outposts, and water management installations, demonstrating that the Nabataean civilization was not confined to Petra, but extended across a vast territory that included the Negev, the Sinai, the Hejaz, and the Hauran. Gluck's surveys transformed the understanding of the Nabataean civilization, revealing it to be not merely a city-state centered on Petra, but a territorial kingdom that controlled and developed a large area of the desert through a combination of trade, agriculture, and hydraulic engineering. The math is striking when we consider the scale of the Nabataean hydraulic achievement across their entire territory. The Nabataeans did not merely build a water system at Petra, they built water systems across the entire desert, at every settlement, every farm, every caravan station, and every military outpost in their territory. The archaeological surveys have identified thousands of individual water management features across the Nabataean homeland, including cisterns, dams, channels, terraces, and runoff agriculture systems that transformed the desert into a productive agricultural landscape. The Nabataean farms of the Negev Desert, which have been extensively studied by Israeli archaeologists, used a technique called runoff agriculture, in which the natural runoff from the desert surface was collected and channeled onto cultivated fields, artificially increasing the effective rainfall by a factor of 20 to 30 and enabling the cultivation of crops, including wheat, barley, grapes, olives, and almonds, in a region that receives less than 100 millimeters of rainfall per year. The technique was so effective that the Nabataean farms of the Negev supported a population of thousands of people, producing surplus crops for export and sustaining a network of villages and towns that thrived in an environment that most civilizations would have considered uninhabitable. Gluck's work was complemented and extended by the research of the Israeli archaeologist Michael Evenari and his colleagues, who conducted a systematic study of the Nabataean runoff agriculture systems of the Negev Desert in the 1950s and 60s. Evenari and his team not only documented the Nabataean agricultural installations, but actually reconstructed several of them and demonstrated that they were still functional, that the 2,000-year-old Nabataean engineering could still capture and distribute water in quantities sufficient to support the cultivation of crops. The Evenari experiments were a landmark in the study of ancient agriculture, demonstrating in practical terms the effectiveness of the Nabataean agricultural technology and suggesting that the techniques developed by the Nabataeans could be adapted for use in modern arid land agriculture. The experiments attracted widespread attention in the scientific community and in the development community, where the Nabataean model of desert agriculture was recognized as a potential solution to the problem of food production in the world's arid regions. The Nabataean agricultural settlements of the Negev were not isolated farms, but components of a planned and integrated settlement system that included villages, towns, and military outposts, all connected by roads and all served by the runoff agriculture system that provided the agricultural base for the entire network. The settlement systems was designed to serve multiple purposes simultaneously, to produce food for the Nabataean population, to provide services for the caravans that passed through the territory, to maintain a military presence that protected the trade routes and the borders of the kingdom, and to assert Nabataean sovereignty over the territory by the physical presence of settled Nabataean populations. The integration of economic, military, and political functions in a single settlement system demonstrates the sophistication of the Nabataean approach to territorial management and the degree to which every aspect of Nabataean life in the desert was organized around the imperative of making productive use of a hostile environment. A third phase of Nabataean studies, beginning in the late 20th century and continuing to the present, has focused on the cultural and the religious dimensions of the Nabataean civilization, revealing a rich and distinctive spiritual life that had been largely overlooked by earlier generations of scholars, who were focused on the architecture and the economy. The Nabataean religion, as reconstructed from the archaeological evidence, the epigraphic evidence, and the limited references in classical sources, was centered on the worship of a pantheon of deities that included Dushara, the chief male deity, whose name means the one of the Shara, a reference to the Shara Mountains near Petra, and Al-Uzza, the chief female deity, who was identified by classical authors with Aphrodite, and who was worshipped throughout the Arabian Peninsula and the Nabataean homeland. The Nabataean religious practice was distinctive in several respects. The Nabataeans did not, at least in the early period of their civilization, represent their gods in human form. Instead, they worshipped their deities in the form of etals, sacred stones or blocks of stone that represented the divine presence, and that were set up in open-air sanctuaries, in temples, and in niches carved into the rock faces of Petra and other Nabataean sites. The use of beetles, or sacred stones, as representations of the divine is an ancient Arabian tradition that predates the Nabataean civilization and that continued in the Arabian Peninsula until the rise of Islam in the 7th century of the Common Era. The Nabataean beetles were typically rectangular blocks of stone, sometimes framed by carved niches or accompanied by inscriptions, and they were the focus of offerings, libations, and other ritual activities that are documented both in the archaeological record and in the inscriptions that the Nabataeans carved on the rock faces of their sacred sites. The numbers are striking when we tally the scale and the diversity of the Nabataean settlement across their territory. The archaeological surveys have identified more than 800 individual monuments at Petra alone, including tombs, temples, banqueting halls, cisterns, and water channels, as well as the remains of residential buildings, workshops, markets, and other structures that constituted the fabric of the city's daily life. Beyond Petra, the Nabataean territory included major settlements at Hegra, in modern Saudi Arabia, which contains the largest concentration of Nabataean rock-cut tombs outside Petra, at Aboda, Nessana, Elusa, Shivta, and Mamshit in the Negev, at Bosra in southern Syria, which served as the northern capital of the Nabataean kingdom, and at numerous smaller sites that are still being discovered and documented by archaeological surveys. A fifth theoretical approach, which has emerged in recent decades, focuses on the Nabataean contribution to broader cultural developments in the ancient Near East, particularly the development of the Arabic script and the transmission of Arabian cultural traditions to the Islamic world. Scholars working in this tradition have argued that the Nabataeans were not merely a local phenomenon, a wealthy but ultimately marginal desert kingdom, but a crucial node in the cultural transmission of ideas, technologies, and artistic traditions from the pre-Islamic Arabian world to the Islamic civilization that succeeded it. The Nabataean script, the Nabataean pottery tradition, the Nabataean architectural tradition, and the Nabataean religious tradition all contributed to the cultural repertoire of the Arabian populations that would later embrace Islam, and the Nabataean cities of the Negev, which continued to function as important settlements into the early Islamic period, served as points of contact and transmission between the Nabataean cultural heritage and the emerging Islamic civilization. The excavation of the Petra Church, or the Byzantine Church, conducted by the American Center of Oriental Research in the 1990s, revealed a remarkable cache of papyrus scrolls that had been carbonized by the fire that destroyed the church in the 6th century of the Common Era. The Petra Scrolls, as they have come to be known, are one of the most important documentary finds from the late antique period in the Near East, and they provide a vivid picture of daily life in Petra during the 6th century, a period that is otherwise poorly documented. The scrolls contain legal documents, property records, tax receipts, and other administrative texts that reveal a community that was still functioning as an organized urban settlement, albeit on a much reduced scale, more than 400 years after the Roman annexation, and more than 200 years after the earthquake of 363. The Petra Scrolls demonstrate that the city did not die suddenly but declined gradually over a period of centuries, from a great capital to a modest provincial town to a village to an abandoned ruin. The site of Hegra, known in antiquity as Hegra and today as Madain Saleh, deserves particular attention because it is the second largest Nabataean site after Petra, and because it provides evidence that is complementary to and, in some cases, different from the evidence from Petra itself. Hegra contains more than 100 rock-cut tombs, many of which are inscribed with the names and the dates of the individuals who commissioned them, inscriptions that provide invaluable information about the Nabataean social structure, the Nabataean dating system, and the Nabataean legal conventions governing the ownership and the use of tombs. The Hegra inscriptions are among the most important sources of evidence for the Nabataean language and script, which was a form of Aramaic written in a distinctive cursive script that would eventually evolve into the Arabic script, a development of enormous historical significance, because it means that the alphabet in which the Quran is written is descended through a chain of scribal transmission that spans more than 1,000 years, from the Nabataean script that was used to inscribe the tombs of Petra and Hegra. The treasury, known in Arabic as Al-Khazneh, is the most famous and most photographed monument at Petra, and it deserves detailed discussion because it embodies the distinctive qualities of the Nabataean architectural tradition in their most refined and most impressive form. The facade of the treasury stands approximately 40 meters high and 25 meters wide, carved directly into the sandstone cliff face at the end of the Sikh, the narrow gorge that serves as the principal entrance to the city. The facade is composed of 2 stories, the lower story consisting of a portico with 6 Corinthian columns supporting a pediment, and the upper story consisting of a tholos, a circular temple form, flanked by 2 half pediments, and adorned with sculptured figures that have been eroded by centuries of wind and rain, but that can still be identified as representations of mythological and religious figures, possibly including Isis, Tyche, and Castor and Pollux. The combination of these diverse architectural elements, Greek columns, a Roman tholos, Egyptian and Nabataean religious symbolism, in a single, unified composition is characteristic of the Nabataean architectural style, which was eclectic in its sources but coherent in its execution. The purpose of the treasury has been debated by scholars for more than a century. The traditional identification as a treasury is based on local Bedouin legend, which holds that the urn at the top of the tholos contained a treasure of gold or jewels, a legend that is reflected in the bullet marks that can still be seen on the urn, the result of Bedouin hunters firing at the urn in the hope of releasing the treasure within. The scholarly consensus, based on the architectural form and the archaeological evidence, is that the treasury was a royal tomb, possibly the tomb of the Nabataean king Aretas IV, and that it was associated with a funerary cult that involved offerings, libations, and memorial banquets in honor of the deceased king. The excavation of the area in front of the treasury has revealed the remains of a courtyard with a water channel and a small garden, features that are consistent with the funerary function of the building, and that suggest that the monument was the focus of ongoing ritual activity. The monastery, known in Arabic as Ad-Dir, is the largest rock-cut monument at Petra, standing approximately 47 meters high and 48 meters wide, carved into the cliff face high above the city on the summit of the western mountain. The monastery is reached by a rock-cut stairway of more than 800 steps that winds up the mountainside through a landscape of spectacular beauty, and the effort required to reach it is rewarded by one of the most impressive views in the ancient world. a panoramic vista that extends across the desert to the horizon, a view that the Nabataeans, who climbed this stairway more than 2,000 years ago, would have seen in essentially the same form that modern visitors see it today. The architectural form of the monastery is similar to that of the treasury, but on a larger scale, with a single story consisting of a portico with columns flanking a central doorway surmounted by an urn that is more than 9 meters tall. The purpose of the monastery is debated, with some scholars identifying it as a tomb and others as a temple or a banqueting hall. But the consensus is that it served a primarily religious function associated with the worship of the deified Nabataean king Obodas I. The evolution of the Nabataean script into the Arabic script is one of the most significant and most underappreciated contributions of the Nabataean civilization to the cultural history of the world. The Nabataeans wrote in a form of Aramaic, the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, using a script that developed from the standard Aramaic script, but that became progressively more cursive and more distinctive over the centuries. As the Nabataean script evolved, its letter forms became increasingly similar to the letter forms of the early Arabic script, and the transition from Nabataean to Arabic, which occurred during the late Roman and early Islamic periods, was so gradual and so seamless that scholars have been able to trace the development of each individual letter of the Arabic alphabet from its Nabataean ancestor. The Nabataean origin of the Arabic script is documented by a small number of transitional inscriptions that are written in Arabic but that use letter forms that are still recognizably Nabataean, inscriptions that bridge the gap between the two scripts and that demonstrate the continuity of the scribal tradition across the centuries. The Nabataean religion underwent a significant transformation over the course of the civilization's history, evolving from the aniconic worship of sacred stones in the early period to the more anthropomorphic worship of gods represented in human form in the later period, a transformation that reflects the broader cultural changes that accompanied the Nabataeans' transition from nomadism to urbanism and their increasing engagement with the Hellenistic and Roman cultures that surrounded them. The early Nabataean religion was characterized by a simplicity and an austerity that was appropriate to a nomadic desert-dwelling people, a religion of sacred stones and open-air sanctuaries, of offerings and libations performed under the open sky, a religion that did not require temples or images or priests, but only the stones that represented the gods and the desert landscape in which they dwelt. As the Nabataean civilization became more urbanized and more cosmopolitan, the religion evolved to incorporate elements from the religious traditions of the surrounding cultures, including the worship of deities in human form, the construction of temples and enclosed sanctuaries, the production of cult statues and religious imagery, and the development of a specialized priesthood that managed the religious life of the community. The Temple of the Winged Lions at Petra, excavated by the American archaeologist Philip Hammond, beginning in 1974, revealed a substantial temple complex dedicated to a female deity, possibly Aludza or a related goddess, whose cult image was represented as a woman with wings, an image that combines elements of the Greek Nike, the Egyptian Isis, and the indigenous Arabian goddess traditions. The temple contained evidence of elaborate ritual activity, including altars for animal sacrifice, basins for ritual washing, and storage facilities for the goods and materials that were used in the conduct of worship. The high place of sacrifice, located on the summit of the mountain above the Petra Theatre, is one of the most important religious sites at Petra, and one of the most evocative examples of Nabataean sacred architecture. The high place consists of a large flat platform carved from the summit of the mountain, with two obelisks, each approximately 6 meters high, standing on either side of the platform. The platform contains carved channels that were probably used for the drainage of sacrificial blood, basins that were used for ritual washing, and a large altar block that was the focus of the sacrificial ritual. The location of the high place, on the summit of the mountain, with panoramic views of the surrounding desert, reflects the Nabataean tradition of mountaintop worship, a tradition that was rooted in the Arabian religious heritage and that associated the presence of the divine with high, remote, and dramatic natural settings. The high place of sacrifice at Petra is one of the best preserved examples of an open-air Nabataean sanctuary, and it provides invaluable evidence for the practice of animal sacrifice in the Nabataean religious system. The funerary traditions of the Nabataeans provide another window into their cultural and religious life. The rock-cut tombs of Petra, which are the most visible and most impressive monuments of the site, were not merely repositories for the dead but places of ongoing ritual activity, where the living continued to honour and to commune with the dead through banquets, offerings, and memorial ceremonies that were conducted in the triclinia, the banqueting chambers, that were carved into the rock alongside the tomb chambers. The triclinium, a room with 3 raised benches along the walls on which the diners reclined while eating, was a standard feature of Nabataean tomb architecture, and the combination of tomb and triclinium demonstrates that the Nabataean funerary tradition was a social, as well as a religious phenomenon, an occasion for communal feasting and for the reinforcement of family and community bonds through the shared memory of the dead. Let us now consider the evidence from specific sites and specific periods, because the details of the archaeological record reveal the complexity and the dynamism of the Nabataean civilization in ways that broad generalizations cannot capture. The transformation of Petra from a nomadic encampment to a monumental city was a gradual process that unfolded over roughly 3 centuries. From the late 4th century before the Common Era, when the Nabataeans first appear in the historical record, to the late 1st century before the Common Era, when the city reached the peak of its architectural splendour under the reign of King Aretas IV, who ruled from approximately 9 before the Common Era to 40 of the Common Era, and who is attested in the New Testament account of the Apostle Paul's escape from Damascus. The early phases of Nabataean occupation at Petra are poorly documented, because the early Nabataean structures were built of perishable materials, tents and temporary shelters that have left little trace in the archaeological record. The transition to permanent, rock-cut architecture appears to have begun in the 3rd century before the Common Era, with the cutting of simple tomb facades into the cliff faces around the city, and it accelerated in the 2nd and 1st centuries before the Common Era, as the growing wealth of the incense trade provided the resources for increasingly elaborate and increasingly ambitious architectural projects. The reign of Aretas IV, known as the One Who Loves His People, was the golden age of the Nabataean kingdom, a period of prosperity, stability, and cultural achievement, during which the most famous monuments of Petra were built, and during which the Nabataean kingdom reached the height of its political and economic power. Aretas IV maintained diplomatic relations with Rome, with the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, and with the other Hellenistic and Near Eastern kingdoms, and he used the wealth of the incense trade to finance an ambitious program of monumental construction that transformed the urban landscape of Petra. The Great Temple, a massive freestanding temple complex in the center of the city, was one of the signature projects of the Aretas IV period, and its excavation by the Brown University team, led by Martha Sharp Jukowski, beginning in 1993, revealed a building of extraordinary scale and sophistication, with elaborately carved columns, painted stucco decoration, and a large garden pool that transformed the arid center of the city into an oasis of greenery and water. The deeper truth about the Nabataeans is that their civilization represents one of the most remarkable examples of human adaptation to an extreme environment in the entire history of civilization, an adaptation that was not merely technological but cultural, encompassing every aspect of Nabataean life, from their economy to their religion, from their architecture to their art, from their social organization to their relationship with the natural world. Let that sink in. The Nabataeans did not fight the desert, they worked with it. They understood the desert as their predecessors, the nomadic Arabian tribes from which they descended, had understood it not as a wasteland to be conquered, but as a landscape to be navigated, a landscape with its own rhythms, its own resources, and its own logic, a logic that was different from the logic of the well-watered lands of the Mediterranean and the Fertile Crescent, but that was, in its own way, equally productive and equally capable of sustaining human civilization. The Nabataean approach to the desert was an approach of adaptation rather than transformation, of working within the constraints of the environment rather than attempting to overcome them, of finding the water where it was rather than bringing it from where it was not. This is not science fiction, it is documented archaeology and documented history. The Nabataean water management system at Petra and across their territory is one of the most extensively studied and most thoroughly documented hydraulic engineering achievements of the ancient world, and the evidence for its sophistication, its efficiency, and its effectiveness is overwhelming. The Nabataeans did not invent the technologies they used. Cisterns, dams, channels, and aqueducts were known throughout the ancient Near East. What the Nabataeans did, and what distinguishes their achievement from the water management practices of other ancient civilizations, was to integrate these individual technologies into a comprehensive, territory-wide system that transformed an arid landscape into a productive and habitable environment, a system that was maintained and improved over a period of more than 500 years, and that sustained a civilization of remarkable wealth, sophistication, and cultural creativity. The Nabataean approach to water management reveals a civilization that was characterized not by the brute force engineering of the Roman aqueducts or the Egyptian pyramids, but by a quieter, more subtle, and in some ways more impressive form of engineering. An engineering that worked with the landscape rather than against it, that respected the natural patterns of water flow rather than attempting to override them, and that achieved its effects not through monumental individual structures, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of small-scale interventions, each one designed to capture, direct, or store a small quantity of water that would otherwise have been lost to evaporation or absorption. The Nabataean system was a system of patience, of attention to detail, and of deep knowledge of the local environment, a system that could not have been designed by an engineer working from a drawing board in a distant capital, but only by people who lived in the landscape, who understood its rhythms, and who had observed, over generations, the patterns of rainfall, runoff, and infiltration that governed the distribution of water across the terrain. The relationship between the Nabataean civilization and the other great desert civilizations of history provides a comparative perspective that enriches our understanding of the Nabataean achievement. The Nabataeans were not the only people in history to build a complex civilization in a desert environment. The ancient Egyptians transformed the desert margins of the Nile Valley into one of the most productive agricultural landscapes in the ancient world. The people of Palmyra in the Syrian desert built a wealthy trading city that rivaled Petra in its architectural grandeur and that played a similar role as an intermediary in the trade between the Mediterranean and the East. The people of Meroe in the Sudanese desert built a kingdom that controlled the gold and the iron resources of the Upper Nile. But the Nabataean achievement stands out even among these impressive examples because the Nabataeans built their civilization in an environment that was more arid, more remote, and more challenging than any of these others, an environment in which the construction of a city of 30,000 people was, by any reasonable standard, an act of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary engineering skill. The comparison with Palmyra is particularly instructive because Palmyra and Petra were, in many ways, mirror images of each other, two desert trading cities that grew wealthy by controlling the caravan routes that connected the East and the West, and that developed distinctive architectural and cultural traditions that combined Hellenistic, Roman, and indigenous elements. Both cities flourished during the same period, roughly the 1st century before the Common Era through the 2nd century of the Common Era, and both cities declined for similar reasons: the shifting of the trade routes, the Roman annexation of their territories, and the environmental degradation of their desert environments. The parallel trajectories of Petra and Palmyra suggest that the Nabataean experience was not unique, but was part of a broader pattern of desert city building in the ancient Near East, a pattern that was shaped by the common factors of trade-based wealth, Roman imperial expansion, and environmental constraint. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the relationship between environment and civilization when we confront the reality of the Nabataean achievement. The conventional narrative of civilization holds that the great civilizations of the ancient world arose in fertile, well-watered environments: the Nile Valley, the Tigris-Euphrates Plain, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, environments where abundant water and fertile soil provided the agricultural surplus that was necessary to support the urban populations, the professional armies, the literate bureaucracies, and the monumental architecture that are the hallmarks of complex civilization. The Nabataeans demolished this narrative because they built a wealthy, sophisticated, and culturally creative civilization in an environment that lacked every one of these advantages, an environment that was hot, dry, rocky, and barren, an environment that most civilizations would have considered uninhabitable, let alone a suitable location for one of the most impressive cities of the ancient world. Let that sink in. The Nabataean achievement challenges the environmental determinism that has long dominated the study of ancient civilizations, the assumption that the environment determines what is possible, and that civilizations can only arise in environments that provide the necessary resources for complex society. The Nabataeans demonstrate that the critical resource for civilization is not water, or soil, or timber, or any other natural resource, but human ingenuity, the capacity of the human mind to find solutions to problems, to adapt to constraints, and to create wealth and beauty in the most unpromising of circumstances. The desert did not prevent the Nabataeans from building a civilization. It shaped the kind of civilization they built. A civilization of traders rather than farmers, of engineers rather than conquerors, of adapters rather than transformers. A civilization that was different in kind from the River Valley civilizations, but that was, in its own terms, equally impressive and equally worthy of study and admiration. The Nabataean water management achievement has a significance that extends beyond the specific context of the ancient Near East, because it demonstrates a model of development that is fundamentally different from the model that has dominated modern thinking about the relationship between civilization and environment. The modern model of development assumes that the environment must be transformed to meet the needs of civilization, that water must be brought from where it is abundant to where it is needed, that deserts must be irrigated, that forests must be cleared, that rivers must be dammed, and that the natural landscape must be reshaped to conform to the requirements of human settlement and economic activity. The Nabataean model was different. It assumed that civilization must be adapted to the environment, that the needs of the population must be matched to the resources that the landscape provides, that water must be collected where it falls, rather than transported from distant sources, and that the natural patterns of the landscape must be respected and exploited, rather than overridden and replaced. The Nabataean model of development was, in modern terms, sustainable, and its sustainability was not accidental but intentional, the product of a deep understanding of the desert environment and a deliberate choice to work within its constraints, rather than attempting to transcend them. The Nabataeans understood that the desert was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be respected, that the water that the desert provided was limited and precious, and must be used with care and with foresight, and that the long-term productivity of the land depended on the careful management of the resources that the landscape provided. The Nabataean water systems were designed to work with the natural patterns of rainfall and runoff, capturing the water that fell on the landscape and storing it for use during the dry periods without depleting groundwater reserves, without diverting rivers, and without creating the environmental degradation that has accompanied so many modern irrigation projects. The Nabataean farms of the Negev, which used runoff agriculture to cultivate crops in a desert environment, did not deplete the soil, did not salinize the land, and did not create the environmental problems that have plagued modern irrigation agriculture in arid regions. The Nabataean approach was sustainable because it was adapted to the environment, because it worked within the constraints that the environment imposed, and because it did not attempt to transform the desert into something it was not. The Nabataean experience also reveals important truths about the relationship between cultural identity and cultural exchange. The Nabataeans were not a culturally isolated people. They were, from the earliest period of their history, in contact with the great civilizations of the ancient world, with the Hellenistic kingdoms, with Egypt, with Mesopotamia, with Rome, and they absorbed elements from all of these cultures into their own. The Nabatean architecture combines Greek columns, Roman arches, Egyptian cornices, and indigenous Arabian motifs in a style that is uniquely Nabatean. The Nabatean religion combined Arabian, Greek, and Egyptian elements in a pantheon that was recognizably syncretic, but also distinctively Nabatean. The Nabatean script, derived from the Aramaic script of the Near East, evolved into a form that was distinctively their own, and that would eventually give rise to the Arabic script. In every domain of cultural life, the Nabataeans demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for cultural absorption and cultural synthesis, borrowing freely from the traditions that surrounded them, while maintaining a cultural identity that was recognizably their own. The capacity for cultural synthesis that characterized the Nabataean civilization was not merely a passive response to external influences, but an active and creative process of selection, adaptation, and transformation. The Nabataeans did not simply copy the architectural forms of the Greeks and the Romans. They selected the elements that served their purposes, adapted them to the requirements of their environment and their cultural traditions, and combined them in ways that were original and distinctive. The result was a civilization that was cosmopolitan without being derivative, that was open to external influences without losing its own identity, and that was creative in the deepest sense of the word, not by inventing new forms from nothing, but by combining existing forms in new and unexpected ways. The Nabatean example also raises profound questions about the nature of wealth and the relationship between material prosperity and cultural creativity. The Nabatean civilization was wealthy, but its wealth was of a distinctive kind, wealth that was generated not by agriculture, not by manufacturing, not by the extraction of natural resources, but by trade, by the control of the flow of goods from one part of the world to another, by the provision of services, logistics, security, water, rest that enabled the trade to function. The Nabataean wealth was, in a sense, immaterial, derived not from the possession of physical resources, but from the control of connections, of nodes in a network, of bottlenecks in a supply chain. The Nabataean experience suggests that wealth can be created not only by the production of goods, but by the facilitation of exchange, not only by the possession of resources, but by the control of access, not only by the transformation of nature, but by the exploitation of geography. The Nabataean pottery provides a material record of this wealth and its cultural expression. Nabataean fine ware, produced at workshops in Petra and at other Nabataean sites, was distributed across the entire Nabataean territory and has been found at sites in Egypt, the Levant, and the Arabian Peninsula, testifying to the commercial reach of the Nabataean economy and to the cultural prestige of the Nabataean artistic tradition. The production of Nabataean fine ware required a high degree of technical skill because the extreme thinness of the vessel walls, often less than 2 millimeters, demanded precise control of the clay composition, the throwing technique, and the firing temperature. The decoration of the pottery, which consisted of delicate geometric and floral patterns painted in red or brown on a cream or buff background, required steady hands, keen eyes, and a refined aesthetic sensibility that had been developed over generations of artistic practice. The quality of Nabataean fine ware is a measure of the cultural sophistication of the Nabataean civilization, a demonstration that the Nabataeans valued beauty and craftsmanship, and that they invested significant resources in the production of objects that served not only practical purposes but aesthetic ones as well. The fragility of trade-based wealth is illustrated by the speed with which the Nabataean economy declined once the trade routes shifted. Within a few generations of the Roman exploitation of the maritime routes, the revenues that had sustained the monumental building programs and the elaborate urban infrastructure of Petra were dramatically reduced, and the city that had been one of the wealthiest in the ancient Near East was well on its way to becoming a provincial backwater. The decline was not the result of military defeat, natural catastrophe or political collapse. It was the result of economic change, the simple, impersonal, and irresistible force of the market, which rewards those who can provide goods and services most efficiently, and punishes those who cannot adapt to changing conditions. The Nabataeans were victims of their own success, because the wealth they had accumulated through the incense trade had made the development of alternative trade routes economically attractive, and the very prosperity that the Nabataeans had created had generated the incentives that ultimately destroyed it. The Nabataean approach to wealth creation has obvious parallels in the modern world, where many of the wealthiest economies are based not on agriculture or manufacturing, but on services, on trade, on the control of strategic nodes in global supply chains, and on the facilitation of exchange between producers and consumers in different parts of the world. The Nabataean example suggests that this model of wealth creation is ancient, that it has been practiced by human societies for at least 2,000 years, and that it is capable of sustaining civilizations of great sophistication and great cultural creativity. But the Nabataean example also suggests that this model of wealth creation is fragile, that it depends on the continued functioning of the trade routes and the continued demand for the services that the intermediary provides, and that when the routes shift or the demand declines, the wealth that they generate evaporates with a speed that can be alarming. The Nabataean artistic tradition deserves particular attention because it reveals a civilization that was not merely wealthy and technologically sophisticated, but that possessed a distinctive aesthetic sensibility, a way of seeing and representing the world that was uniquely Nabataean, and that set them apart from the other civilizations of the ancient Near East. The Nabataean pottery tradition, known as Nabataean fineware or Nabataean painted ware, produced some of the thinnest and most delicately decorated pottery in the entire ancient world, vessels with walls as thin as 1 to 2 millimeters, decorated with intricate geometric and floral patterns in dark red paint on a cream or buff background. The quality of Nabataean fineware was so exceptional that it has been compared to the finest porcelain, and its distribution across the Nabataean territory and beyond testifies to the sophistication of the Nabataean craft tradition and to the importance of aesthetic refinement in Nabataean culture. The integration of water features into the urban landscape of Petra was another expression of the Nabataean aesthetic sensibility, a sensibility that valued the contrast between the aridity of the desert and the abundance of water that the Nabataean engineers had created within the city. The gardens, the pools, the fountains, and the water channels of Petra were not merely functional installations. They were aesthetic statements, declarations of the Nabataean capacity to create beauty and abundance in the heart of the desert, to transform the most hostile landscape on earth into a place of pleasure and of wonder. The discovery of the garden pool in front of the great temple, with its island pavilion and its surrounding plantings, revealed a sophistication in landscape design that had not previously been attributed to the Nabataeans, and that demonstrated the degree to which the Nabataean elite valued the creation of beautiful and pleasurable environments as expressions of their wealth, their power, and their cultural refinement. The Nabataean approach to art and architecture was also characterized by a distinctive relationship with the natural landscape, a relationship that was different from the relationship that characterized the art and architecture of the other civilizations of the ancient world. The Greek and Roman architects built their temples and their public buildings from quarried stone, creating structures that were separate from and imposed upon the natural landscape. The Nabataean architects carved their most impressive monuments from the living rock of the desert, creating structures that were integral parts of the landscape, that grew out of the rock rather than being placed upon it, that took their color and their texture from the natural stone, and that changed their appearance with the changing light, glowing with warm pinks and ambers at sunrise and sunset and receding into deep shadows at midday. The relationship between the Nabataean architecture and the natural landscape was not accidental. It was a deliberate aesthetic choice, an expression of the Nabataean understanding that beauty is not something that is imposed on nature, but something that is found within it, that the most beautiful buildings are not those that dominate the landscape, but those that harmonize with it. The Nabataean sculpture tradition also reveals a distinctive aesthetic sensibility. In the early period of their civilization, the Nabataeans did not represent their gods or their rulers in human form, preferring instead the abstract representations of the Beetils, the sacred stones that were the focus of Nabataean worship. As the Nabataean civilization became more urbanized and more influenced by the Hellenistic and Roman cultures that surrounded it, the Nabataeans began to adopt anthropomorphic representation, carving human figures in stone and painting them in fresco. But even in their later, more Hellenized phase, the Nabataean art retained a distinctive quality, a combination of classical forms and indigenous sensibilities that produced a style that was neither purely Hellenistic nor purely Arabian, but something new, a creative hybrid that expressed the unique cultural identity of the Nabataean people. What does the Nabataean story mean for our understanding of civilization, of the relationship between human societies and their environments, and of the forces that shape the rise and fall of complex societies? The implications are profound, and they extend well beyond the specific details of the Nabataean archaeological record into fundamental questions about human adaptability, economic vulnerability, and the fragility of prosperity. The first implication is that the environment does not determine the destiny of a civilization. It sets constraints, it shapes possibilities, and it creates challenges, but it does not dictate outcomes. The Nabataeans were dealt one of the worst environmental hands in the ancient world, a hot, dry, rocky desert with minimal rainfall, minimal vegetation, and minimal natural resources, and they turned it into one of the best, a trading empire that was among the wealthiest in the ancient Near East, a city that was among the most beautiful, and a culture that was among the most distinctive. The Nabataean story is a rebuke to environmental determinism and a celebration of human agency, a demonstration that human beings are not passive recipients of their environmental circumstances, but active shapers of their own destiny, capable of finding opportunity in adversity and of creating wealth and beauty in the most unlikely of places. The second implication concerns the vulnerability of trade-based economies. The Nabataean civilization was built on trade, and when the trade routes shifted, the civilization declined. The parallel with the modern world is obvious and sobering. Many modern economies, like the Nabataean economy, are built on the control of bottlenecks in global supply chains, on the extraction and the export of natural resources, on the provision of services that connect producers in one part of the world with consumers in another. The Nabataean experience demonstrates that control of a bottleneck is a powerful economic advantage, but it is also a fragile one, because bottlenecks can be bypassed, because alternative routes can be developed, and because the competitive advantage that a bottleneck provides can be eroded by technological change, by political realignment, or by the simple economics of supply and demand. The Nabataeans were middlemen, and the fate of middlemen throughout history has been determined by the degree to which the producers and the consumers they connect can find alternative ways to reach each other. The fourth implication concerns the role of cultural synthesis in civilizational achievement. The Nabataean civilization was, in the deepest sense, a synthetic civilization, a civilization that drew its architectural forms from Greece and Rome, its religious iconography from Egypt and Arabia, its script from Aramaic, its commercial practices from the long tradition of Arabian trade, and its hydraulic technology from the accumulated knowledge of desert peoples across the ancient Near East. The Nabataean genius lay not in the invention of new forms, but in the creative combination of existing forms, in the capacity to take elements from diverse cultural traditions and to combine them into something that was greater than the sum of its parts, something that was recognizably Nabataean and that could not have been produced by any of the individual traditions from which it drew. The Nabataean example demonstrates that cultural creativity is not necessarily a matter of invention from scratch, but can be a matter of synthesis, of combination, of the creative juxtaposition of elements that were previously separate, a form of creativity that is undervalued in the modern world, but that has been one of the most productive forms of cultural innovation throughout human history. The Nabataeans were synthesizers, combiners, integrators, artists, who worked not with paint and canvas but with cultural traditions, blending the artistic vocabularies of a dozen civilizations into a single, coherent, and beautiful expression of their own unique identity. The Nabataean story is also a story about the power of geographical position. The Nabataeans were wealthy, not because they possessed valuable natural resources, not because they had fertile agricultural land, not because they had a large population or a powerful army, but because they occupied a strategic position at the intersection of the major trade routes that connected the production centers of southern Arabia to the consumption markets of the Mediterranean world. The value of geographical position, the control of a bottleneck or a choke point in a transportation network, is a recurring theme in the economic history of the ancient and the modern world, and the Nabataean experience provides one of the earliest and most instructive examples of the power and the vulnerability of position-based wealth. The modern parallels are obvious, from the oil-rich kingdoms of the Persian Gulf to the container ports of Singapore and Hong Kong to the technology hubs of Silicon Valley and Shenzhen, all of which derive their wealth in part from their position in global networks of production and exchange, and all of which are vulnerable, as the Nabataeans were vulnerable, to the shifting of those networks, to other channels and other locations. The desert peoples of the modern world, the Bedouin of Jordan and Saudi Arabia, the Tuareg of the Sahara, the Aboriginal peoples of the Australian outback, have long been treated by the settled civilizations that surround them as marginal, as primitive, as peoples who have failed to achieve the level of civilization that the settled peoples take for granted. The Nabataean example challenges this prejudice because it demonstrates that desert peoples are capable of building civilizations of extraordinary sophistication and cultural richness, civilizations that are different in kind from the civilizations of the river valleys and the fertile plains, but that are equally impressive and equally worthy of study and admiration. The desert is not a barrier to civilization. It is a different kind of environment, one that requires a different kind of adaptation, and that produces a different kind of civilization. But a civilization nonetheless, as the ruins of Petra and the inscriptions of Hegra and the water channels of the Negev attest. The Nabataean story also challenges the conventional periodization of history that divides the ancient world into neat categories: Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Islamic, and that treats the civilizations of the desert and the Arabian Peninsula as marginal to the main narrative of Mediterranean and Near Eastern history. The Nabataeans were not marginal. They were at the center of the ancient world's commercial system, controlling the trade routes that connected the production centers of southern Arabia and India to the consumption markets of the Mediterranean. And their civilization, far from being a provincial backwater, was a sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and culturally creative society that made significant contributions to the art, the architecture, the religion, and the linguistic heritage of the ancient Near East. The marginalization of the Nabataeans in the standard historical narrative is not a reflection of their historical importance, but of the biases of the historical tradition, which has tended to privilege the literary cultures of Greece and Rome at the expense of the less literary but equally impressive cultures of the desert and the Arabian Peninsula. The recent designation of Hegra as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2008 and the ongoing development of the site as a cultural tourism destination by the Saudi Arabian authorities reflects a growing recognition of the importance of the Nabataean cultural heritage and a growing commitment to its preservation and its presentation to the wider world. The study of the Nabataeans is no longer a niche specialty within ancient Near Eastern studies, but a thriving field of research that attracts scholars from archaeology, history, epigraphy, linguistics, art history, and environmental science, all of whom bring their own methods and their own perspectives to bear on the study of a civilization that continues to surprise and to inspire. There is a philosophical pause here, a moment when the specific facts of the Nabataean story yield to a broader meditation on the nature of prosperity and its relationship to permanence. The Nabataeans were wealthy. Their city was magnificent. Their architecture was stunning. Their engineering was brilliant. And yet, none of it lasted because the economic foundation on which it all rested, the control of the incense trade routes, was not permanent, was not secure, was not immune to the forces of change that eventually swept it away. The Nabataean story is a meditation on the impermanence of wealth, on the fragility of prosperity, and on the danger of building a civilization on a single economic advantage, however powerful that advantage may seem at the time. There is a second philosophical pause here, a moment when the specific economic and political details of the Nabataean story yield to a broader contemplation of the relationship between human ambition and natural constraint. The Nabataeans dreamed big. They carved palaces from the living rock of the desert mountains. They built a city of tens of thousands in a landscape that receives less than 150 millimeters of rainfall a year. They controlled trade routes that stretched for thousands of kilometers across some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. They created a culture that synthesized the artistic traditions of half a dozen civilizations into something new and distinctive and beautiful. And yet, all of this, all the engineering and the artistry and the commerce and the diplomacy, was built on a single vulnerable foundation, the control of the incense trade routes, a foundation that proved to be as impermanent as the desert sand that eventually buried the ruins of the Nabataean city. The impermanence of the Nabataean achievement is a reminder that all human civilizations are built on foundations that are, in the long run, impermanent. The environmental conditions change, the trade routes shift, the political alliances dissolve, the technologies that once provided a competitive advantage are superseded by newer technologies. The institutions that once organized and directed human effort become rigid and unresponsive. The values and the beliefs that once motivated and inspired the population lose their power and their relevance. The Nabataean experience is not unique in this regard. It is merely a particularly vivid and a particularly instructive example of a process that has occurred repeatedly throughout human history, the process by which civilizations rise, flourish, and decline, each one in its own way, each one for its own reasons, but all of them subject to the same fundamental truth, that nothing lasts forever and that the works of human hands, however impressive and however beautiful, are ultimately at the mercy of forces that are beyond human control. The third implication concerns the relationship between cultural creativity and environmental constraint. The Nabatee civilization was shaped by the desert, not only in its economy and its engineering, but in its art, its architecture, its religion, and its entire way of being in the world. The desert was not merely the setting of the Nabataean story. It was the protagonist, the force that shaped every aspect of the civilization, from the water channels that sustained the city to the rock-cut facades that adorned it, from the trade routes that enriched it to the sacred stones that sanctified it. The Nabataean response to the desert was not merely a technological response. It was a cultural response, a comprehensive adaptation that encompassed every dimension of human life, and that produced a civilization that was, in its own terms, as complete, as coherent, and as culturally rich as any of the great river valley civilizations that have traditionally dominated the study of the ancient world. The question of what was lost when the Nabataean civilization disappeared is one that deserves reflection, because the Nabataean achievement was not merely material but intellectual and cultural, encompassing a body of knowledge about desert survival, water management, trade logistics, and cultural adaptation that was accumulated over centuries of experience, and that was lost when the civilization that had produced it was absorbed into the Roman, and later the Islamic cultural mainstream. The Nabataean knowledge of water management, in particular, represented a body of practical wisdom that was specific to the desert environment and that had been refined over generations of observation, experimentation, and adaptation. When the Nabataean civilization declined and the Nabataean water systems fell into disrepair, this knowledge was lost, and the desert reclaimed the land that the Nabataeans had made productive, a reclamation that continued for more than a millennium until modern archaeologists and engineers began to study the Nabataean systems and to recognize the sophistication and the effectiveness of the techniques they employed. the modern study of Nabataean water management has inspired practical applications in the arid regions of the modern world. Researchers at several Israeli universities have studied the Nabataean runoff agriculture systems of the Negev and have demonstrated that the techniques used by the Nabataeans are applicable to modern desert agriculture, providing a low-technology, low-cost method of water collection and crop irrigation that can increase agricultural productivity in arid regions without the need for expensive modern irrigation infrastructure. The Nabataean example demonstrates that ancient knowledge, far from being merely of historical interest, can have practical applications in the modern world, and that the study of ancient civilizations can contribute not only to our understanding of the past, but to our capacity to solve the problems of the present and the future. The relationship between the Nabataeans and the Roman Empire also offers lessons about the dynamics of power between small, wealthy states and large imperial powers. The Nabataean kingdom survived for more than 3 centuries in the shadow of the Roman Empire, maintaining its independence through a combination of diplomacy, economic leverage, and military deterrence, and it was absorbed into the Roman Empire not through dramatic military conquest, but through a gradual process of economic integration, political accommodation, and, ultimately, formal annexation. The Nabataean experience demonstrates that small states can survive and even prosper in the shadow of empires, but that their survival depends on their ability to maintain the economic advantages that make them valuable to the empire, and that when those advantages are lost, the independence that they sustained is lost as well. And so we return to Petra, to the narrow gorge of the Sick, to the rose-red city that Burckhardt revealed to the modern world more than 2 centuries ago, the city that the Nabataeans carved from the living rock of the desert in one of the most audacious acts of architectural creation in the history of human civilization. The Sick is quiet now. The camel trains that once brought frankincense and myrrh from the markets of southern Arabia no longer pass through its narrow walls. The merchants who once haggled in the markets of the city centre, the priests who once offered incense at the temples of Dushara and Al-Udza, the engineers who once maintained the channels and the cisterns that kept the city alive, are all gone, their names forgotten, their voices silenced, their civilization buried under the sands and the debris of 2,000 years. The monuments remain. The treasury still stands at the end of the Sick, its facade glowing in the afternoon light with the same warm, luminous pink that Burckhardt saw when he first laid eyes on it in 1812. The monastery, high on the mountain above the city, still commands its panoramic view of the surrounding desert, its massive facade, the largest in Petra, rising more than 47 meters above the terrace on which it stands. The royal tombs still line the cliff face of the eastern mountain, their facades a catalogue of Nabataean architectural styles, from the simple pilaster facades of the early period to the elaborate classical compositions of the later period. The high place of sacrifice, on the summit of the mountain above the theatre, still bears the marks of the rituals that were performed there. The channels for the blood of the sacrificial animals, the platforms for the altars, the niches for the beetles of the Nabataean gods. The Nabataean achievement has been recognized in the modern world by the designation of Petra as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1985, and by its selection as one of the new 7 Wonders of the World in a global poll conducted in 2007, recognitions that reflect the enduring power of the Nabataean monuments to inspire wonder and admiration. The tourism industry that has grown around Petra is now one of the most important sources of revenue for the Jordanian economy, and the city that was once the capital of a trading empire has become in a sense a trading center once again, exchanging not frankincense and myrrh, but the experience of beauty, the experience of wonder, the experience of standing before the treasury at the end of the Sick, of feeling the cool shadow of the gorge give way to the warm glow of the sunlit facade, of seeing for the first time the rose-red monument that has captured the imagination of the world, and seeing what Burckhardt saw more than 2 centuries ago, a facade of breathtaking beauty carved from the rose-red rock of the desert. The Nabataeans, who made their living by facilitating the movement of goods and people through the desert, would perhaps appreciate the irony that their city now makes its living by facilitating the movement of tourists through the same landscape, a continuation of the Nabataean commercial tradition, in a form that the Nabataean merchants could never have imagined. The city that once connected Arabia to the Mediterranean now connects the past to the present, the ancient to the modern, the forgotten to the remembered, serving as a bridge across the millennia that allows the modern visitor to stand in the footsteps of the Nabataean merchants and engineers and artists, and to glimpse, however briefly and however imperfectly, the world that they created in the heart of the desert. The silence of Petra is the silence of the desert, the deep, encompassing silence that swallows sound, and that seems to exist not as the absence of noise, but as a positive presence, a force in its own right, a quality of the landscape that is as tangible and as oppressive as the heat and the light. The silence of Petra is also the silence of the Nabataeans, the silence of a people who built one of the most extraordinary cities in the ancient world, and who then disappeared from history, leaving behind only the stone facades, the cisterns, the inscriptions, and the pottery to tell their story. The Nabataeans did not leave a literary tradition. They left no histories, no epics, no philosophical treatises, no religious texts, no poetry. Their writing was functional, confined to inscriptions on tombs, on temples, on dedications to the gods, and to the administrative documents of the palace and the marketplace. The inner life of the Nabataean people, their thoughts, their beliefs, their stories, their songs, is lost. Beyond the reach of archaeology, beyond the reach of epigraphy, beyond the recovery of the modern scholar. The Nabataean civilization lasted for roughly 5 centuries, from the late 4th century before the Common Era to the early 2nd century of the Common Era, a span that is comparable to the duration of the Roman Republic or the Ottoman Empire. In those 5 centuries, the Nabataeans transformed themselves from a nomadic tribe to a settled kingdom, from tent dwellers to city builders, from desert raiders to international merchants, and they produced a civilization that was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable in the ancient world. The transformation was driven by trade, sustained by engineering, and expressed in an artistic and architectural tradition that combined the influences of a dozen cultures into something new, something distinctive, and something beautiful. The transformation was also, in the end, reversible, because the economic foundation on which it rested was not permanent, and when the trade routes shifted, the wealth that had sustained the civilization evaporated, and the desert that the Nabataeans had tamed reclaimed the land that they had made productive. The lesson of the Nabataean story is not that desert civilizations are doomed to fail. It is that all civilizations are built on foundations that are, in the long run, impermanent, and that the permanence of a civilization depends not on the permanence of its economic base, but on the adaptability of its people, their capacity to find new sources of wealth when the old ones fail, to develop new technologies when the old ones become obsolete, and to create new cultural forms when the old ones lose their relevance. The Nabataeans were adaptable. They transformed themselves from nomads to city builders in the space of a few generations, and they adapted their culture, their religion, and their economy to the changing conditions of the Hellenistic and Roman world, with a flexibility and a creativity that were remarkable. But the challenges they faced in their final centuries, the shift of the trade routes, the Roman annexation, the environmental deterioration, proved to be beyond their capacity to adapt, and the civilization that had risen from the desert returned to the desert from which it had come. The Nabataean legacy survives, nonetheless, in forms that are both visible and invisible. The visible legacy is Petra itself, the rock-cut city that has become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, a site that draws more than 500,000 visitors each year, and that has been designated a World Heritage Site by UNESCO. The invisible legacy is the Arabic script, the writing system that the Nabataeans developed from the Aramaic script, and that evolved, through centuries of scribal transmission, into the script in which the Quran was written, and in which more than 1 billion people write today. The Nabataean origin of the Arabic script is one of the great unrecognized contributions of the ancient world to the modern world, a contribution that connects the inscriptions on the tombs of Petra to the calligraphy of the mosques of Cairo, Istanbul, and Isfahan, a chain of cultural transmission that spans 2,000 years, and that demonstrates the enduring power of the written word to transcend the civilizations that created it. The transformation of Petra from a living city to a tourist destination is itself a phenomenon worthy of reflection. The city that was once the capital of a trading empire, a place of commerce and worship and daily life, is now a museum, a site to be visited and photographed and admired, but not inhabited, not used, not lived in. The tourists who walk through the Sikh and stand before the treasury are seeing Petra as no Nabataean ever saw it, as a ruin, as a monument, as a spectacle, stripped of the human activity, the noise, the smell, the bustle, the commerce, the worship, the daily life that once filled its streets and its buildings and its temples. The Nabataeans who carved the treasury and the monastery and the royal tombs did not see them as we see them, as works of art to be admired for their beauty. They saw them as functional structures, as tombs for the dead, as temples for the gods, as banqueting halls for the living, structures that served specific purposes in the daily life of a living community, and that derived their meaning not from their aesthetic qualities, but from the social and religious functions performed. The inscription that appears on many of the Nabataean tombs at Hegra, forbidding the sale or the transfer of the tomb, and cursing anyone who violates this prohibition, is a reminder of the human dimension of the Nabataean achievement, the dimension that is most easily lost when we focus on the monumental architecture and the hydraulic engineering and the trade statistics. The Nabataean tombs were not merely architectural achievements. They were family possessions, places where the dead were laid to rest and where the living gathered to remember and to mourn, places that were charged with personal meaning and personal emotion. The curse inscriptions, with their invocations of the Nabataean gods and their threats against violators, speak to us across 2,000 years of silence, reminding us that the Nabataeans were not merely engineers and merchants and architects, but human beings, people who loved their dead and who feared for the integrity of their final resting places, people whose emotional lives were as rich and as complex as our own. The desert remains. The sandstone mountains still glow with the same warm, luminous colours that the Nabataean sculptors carved and that the Nabataean residents saw every day of their lives, the pinks and the salmons and the ambers and the purples that shift and change with the angle of the light, and that give Petra its famous epithet, the rose-red city half as old as time. The desert wind still blows through the Sikh, carving the sandstone into shapes that are as beautiful and as ephemeral as the civilization that once sheltered within them. The water still falls, briefly and violently, in the winter rains, racing down the wadis and filling the cisterns and the channels that the Nabataean engineers carved into the rock 2,000 years ago. Cisterns that still hold water, channels that still function, engineering that still works, a testament to the skill and the foresight of the people who built them, and a reminder that the best of what we build can outlast the civilizations that created it. The study of the Nabataeans continues, and new discoveries are made every year, expanding our knowledge of the civilization and occasionally challenging our assumptions about it. The ongoing excavations at Petra, conducted by teams from Jordan, the United States, Europe, and other countries, continue to reveal new buildings, new inscriptions, new artifacts, and new information about the daily life, the economy, the religion, and the social organization of the Nabataean people. The use of modern technology, including satellite imagery, aerial photography, and ground-penetrating radar, has revealed previously unknown features of the Nabataean landscape, including buried buildings, hidden water channels, and ancient roads that are invisible on the surface, but that can be detected by remote sensing techniques. The application of scientific methods, including radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, and ancient DNA analysis, is providing new information about the chronology of the Nabataean settlement, the diet and the health of the Nabataean population, and the genetic origins and the ethnic composition of the Nabataean people. The Nabataean story is not finished. It is still being written, one excavation, one inscription, one analysis at a time, And the picture that is emerging is richer, more complex, and more fascinating than anything that Burckhardt could have imagined when he walked through the sick for the first time more than 2 centuries ago. The Nabataeans looked at the desert and saw possibility. They saw trade routes where others saw trackless waste. They saw water where others saw only sand. They saw beauty where others saw only desolation. They saw a home where others saw only exile. And they built, in the heart of the most inhospitable landscape on earth, a civilization of extraordinary wealth, extraordinary beauty, and extraordinary ingenuity, a civilization that flourished for 5 centuries and that left behind, in the rose-red rock of the Petra Mountains, a monument to the capacity of the human spirit to transform adversity into achievement, to find wealth in scarcity, to discover beauty in desolation, and to carve from the silent and indifferent rock of the desert mountains a city that has endured for 2,000 years and that will endure for 2,000 more, a city that speaks across the centuries to all who see it, reminding them that the human capacity for creation is as vast and as enduring as the desert itself, and that the greatest achievements of the human spirit are not those that are built on abundance, but those that are built on constraint, on discipline, on the refusal to accept that the desert has the final word, to find abundance in scarcity, to create order in chaos, and to carve beauty from the living rock of the indifferent earth.